Well, fáilte roimhas deach ag an eagrán is déanaí de ceilliú cíbhnareachta agus pád creaaltaí sógaine Ardan. Argamid an tear gréanna agsúla de agsúlacht agus dúchlein na cathraach. You're very welcome into the latest episode of Platform, or Ardan in Irish. It's an opportunity during this year of celebrating custodianship to explore the challenges of living and coexisting in a divided city with divided allegiances. Today I'm delighted to have two guests, one from the south of the city originally, but now resident in Andersonstown, Jude Whyte. Do you ever tell Jude?
On the way. I guess very happy to be here. Thank you for your invite.
No
Indeed.
problem. And the other is John Kyle, a wise man from the east, I'm told, by Paula Bruno, who's also from the east.
Well, I'm from the east, Jake. Yeah, grew up there and lived most of my life in the east, apart from a 7-year spell in London.
Brilliant. So, John, you yourself, you can tell us who you are. I'll just begin by saying that you're a UUP councillor. Recently moved from the PUP over nuanced differences on the protocol facing in the election. How do you feel?
Yep. Well, I feel that the protocol is a real problem. I think sometimes people tend to dismiss it as if it's really just some trade laws, but I think there's a whole element of identity tied up in it. I think it is a real and genuine and present problem. I think it hasn't been handled terribly well. I think all parties are partly responsible for the mess that we're in. I think it's solvable. I think that we can find a way through it and find a good way through it, in a way that we end up in a better place than we were before it. But there's a lot of work still to be done. I think the move that I made was the right move at the right time. Let me say that I got involved in politics because of David Irvine. I admired what he did, what he represented, what he said, and my sort of the reason why I got inveigled into politics was because I wanted to give him some support. And then just as a bit of personal background, okay, so I'm I suppose a very typical Ulster Scot prod family, where mother was Stuart, father was Kyle. Grew up in East Belfast. My mother's people were from North Down. My father's people were from Tyrone. Went to school in Gilnahirk, which is in the suburbs, a farming community in East Belfast. Attended the local Presbyterian church. Went to Gilnahirk Primary School. Went to Grosvenor High School, as it was then. They've now rebranded as Grosvenor Grammar. I went to Grosvenor High School, then to Queen's. And you know, I had a great childhood, a great family, positive experience in school. But you know, I knew only 2 or 3 Catholics by the time I got to university. I knew a handful of Catholics, and then I began a journey of discovery and got drawn into all sorts of very interesting and positive things. But it was that childhood that was almost hermetically sealed from the community that lives here and grew up here. So that's my background.
Yeah, just that you mentioned Gilnahirk, I had an uncle through marriage, Stanley Hill, who lived in Gilnahirk. Stanley was an Anglican, and our family, very close family, but we all arrived over with mass cards to Gilnahirk. And it was automatically a cultural clash. Everybody's looking, what are these? Jude Whyte, who's he?
Well, I like Kyle. I had a wonderful childhood as well. I come from the University Street. You went out the door, if you took a right, you were in the North Cricket Club. And to this day, it's my second favourite sport after hurling. And if you took a left, you had Queen's University, the Botanic Gardens, the hothouse, the museum. The 60s, I look back, we went to school up at St Bernard's because my grandfather was the principal there. We actually went past 2 Catholic schools to get to it. And I can still remember the big freeze in 1963. My mum and dad throwing us out the door to get a bus of about 4 miles, and we were only 6 or 7 years of age. It was an idyllic childhood. You couldn't have wanted for more. Mum was working, Dad was working. We were typical working class Catholics. My dad worked down in the markets as an accountant, he would have told us, but it was essentially a clerk. Mum was a typist up in the Wellington Park Hotel, working for the Moonies, who at that time owned it. I remember England winning the World Cup and being so delighted. I could still name the whole team nearly over 50 years later. And a far better day came the following year when Celtic won the European Cup. And because they were the first to do it, there was something in me that made me feel a wee bit superior to my friends Sammy Fee and Alistair Hamilton. And you can guess by their names, they weren't going to St Malachy's Church on a Sunday with me. The following year down brought the Sam Maguire, a very Protestant sounding trophy, across the border. So, I mean, I look upon the 60s, I honestly couldn't have wanted for a better childhood. We went to far-flung places on our holidays like Ballyholme and Bangor. And I can remember the excitement. My daddy worked for Torney Brothers. I can remember the excitement. This is nearly incredible to think this. A lorry arriving up, and you actually took some of your furniture with you down to Bangor and Ballyholme on your holidays. And the only precondition for hiring a house was it had to be near a Catholic church. So we were in a wee place in Ballyholme where the Catholic church was about three doors away, and your holidays were up in the morning, mass, and then onto the beach. Your man threw you onto the beach about 6 o'clock at night. It was idyllic. It could not have been better. My neighbours were all Protestants. A few doors up the street, there was a very strange man, Mr. Hamilton, who was an osteopath and a homeopath. And you can imagine how complicated those words were in the 60s. And a few doors down was the Fees, Sammy Fee, Margaret Fee, Billy Fee, all great mates. And my first job when I was 9 was I got a job as a cleaner next door to my house. That was the only Lutheran church at the time in Belfast, 141 University Street. And I got 10p for cleaning the church. And the pastor was a woman called Rosemary Cobalt, and she had a beautiful light blue Volkswagen that the congregation bought her. And we used to spin around, and I was her sort of blue-eyed boy. And I can barely describe how happy a childhood it was. It was a bohemian area, University Street. It seemed that anybody who wasn't firmly nailed down just gravitated towards that street. So you had not only the Catholics and Protestants, I suppose, were nearly a minority. We were with homeopaths and osteopaths and things like bed and breakfasts, and things that nowadays I suppose are quite normal in this society. Wonderful childhood, and it wasn't really until the late 60s, as I got to primary 7 maybe, that I got this impression something just wasn't right. But from my mother's point of view, she would have said she was lucky to be born and to rear 10 children in the north of Ireland. As she used to say, it's the family allowance, son. It's the family allowance. We're actually paid to have children up here. And the Republic, as she would have seen it, I suppose, would have been a foreign land. As for the Falls Road, she couldn't understand what these people were, what was wrong with this place. She couldn't understand. And I can remember once she said to me, sure, they would fight with their shadow on that Falls Road. So, I hope I don't get put out of West Belfast with these comments.
These are all the idyllic. Two things you said struck a chord with me. I remember the big snow. I was living with my grandmother Hagan at the time in Jamaica Street in Ardan, and she was buried in the February of the big snow, and they actually had to shovel the snow out. So that was I moved down to my other grannies, and then 1968, my first All Ireland. Gone down to watch down, and we stopped en route at Drogheda Cathedral, And it was myself, our Carol, Pauline, my father, and Vincey Hetherington driving a big Ford Zephyr. And we went in and looking at the withered skull of Oliver Plunkett, and our Carol was a bit of a cowlie, so I nipped her, and she let a yelp out of her, and my father drew his hand across my ear and said, "You ill-reared brat, that man was hung, drawn and quartered for Ireland." And I hadn't a clue what he was talking about. But anyway, Jude, you're now a lecturer in the Belfast Tech,
Yes.
or whatever it.
We're called the Metropolitan College now. Yeah, yeah.
We've all moved on.
We've all moved on.
So, the idyllic childhood didn't last. Like the rest of us, the underlying tensions in this society erupted in the late 60s, and we then plunged ourselves into 40 years of mutual slaughter, and we're now still feeling our way out of that. So tell us a bit about that awakening that not everything was okay.
The Armour Road was, I suppose, quite different from, I suppose, the Shankill and the Falls, and the outbreak of what I suppose we call, and I do understand people object to this, the troubles of the civil conflict, seemed to be over on the other end of town. North and West Belfast, the Falls, Ardan, those were the types of areas, and our job was basically to avoid them. The very first encounter that I felt something wasn't wrong, obviously, was the day I started school in Barrack Street, the Christian Brothers, and of course you had to walk up the Falls Road because I started in September, and one couldn't believe that this was less than a mile and a half from where I lived. I can still remember the barricades. I think it was Agnew was a Volkswagen franchise. I can still see these Volkswagens burning, and the two bars on the Armour Road. The Hatfield at that time would have been a mixed / more Protestant bar, but not loyalist bar, if you know what I mean. And the Rose and Crown would have been more of, I suppose, of a Catholic bar. The one incident that I can remember is because we lived so close to the Botanical Gardens, we went round to Ulster 71, and I can remember that's the first time I heard the word Fenian. It's the first time I can ever remember a fella dropping a chain and asking us where we're Fenians. Now, we were only, I suppose, kids at 13 or 14, and I genuinely had no idea. What a Fenian was. I mean, you must remember, my man and dad, we were cut from a finer cloth than these hellions over in the Falls Road. We didn't know what was wrong with these people. They were getting family allowance. What is wrong with you people? This is the greatest place in the world to live. Why do you want to go to the south of Ireland? They don't even have roads. They're still living in fields. They're still eating potatoes. That was nearly the mentality. Like, we nearly were unionists. And I often think back that nationalism and republicanism nearly defined itself. And I certainly defined my politics by the way I was treated. And I often feel if I was treated better, one would not hold, I suppose, the views that I have. And I can remember going to school, and I was stopped by the UDR at the corner of Árdan Street, which is Árdan Street, Cromwell Road, Canterbury Street, Westminster Street. They were just streets. Now I know some more thought should have went into naming those streets. You could hardly name a street Adolf Hitler Street in a Jewish area, even if it is 500-600 years after those events. And I can remember being asked, did I have any tattoos? And I distinctly remember this UDR man telling, when he asked me my parents' names, my mother was Peggy from the market, and my dad, this very, very unusual name, Isidore. And he said, Isidore, well, your dad must be a Fenian. And that was the second time I'd heard this word. And I mean, to be honest, when I look back, I was completely overawed by this stuff. I had no idea why, first of all, a 13, 14-year-old boy would be stopped in shorts, probably, with my school blazer on my way into school. And he put a gun straight into my mouth. And that memory has never left me. I remember it for two reasons. One, it was my birthday. It was September the 5th. And the second reason, which is more profound, is when I went into school, I told my teacher what had happened, and he didn't believe me. And I understand that people may not believe that. I totally understand that this is just some poor wee me syndrome. And he, as punishment, made me do lines. And the irony was, he made me conjugate the verb in Latin, to love. Amo, amas, amat, amamus, amantus, amat. And I can remember having to write that 100 times. And that teacher who I met about 3 or 4 years ago, who's still alive, I remember telling him this story, and he actually said to me, you must understand that people from my background, essentially middle class Catholics, could not accept that sort of stuff at a micro level went on. Because I often do feel your politics is often defined by the nest you live in. And in many respects, I haven't permission to name him. His son is actually a reasonably prominent councillor now in Belfast, and we have talked about that. The rivalry, bizarrely, between Celtic and Rangers began to emerge with my friends, Alistair. And it's not bitter rivalry, but there was something about that domination of Celtic. And I've got to put on the record, I wouldn't go to the bottom of my garden if the World Cup final was there. I have no interest in soccer whatsoever, but I'm absolutely infatuated. I go to the odd soccer match to watch the crowds. I have no interest in the football. And that's another predominant sort of feeling that there's something wasn't right. And as I got a wee bit older, I got the impression I was on the wrong side. I was on the wrong side.
John, your kind of sense of yourself and your sense of place growing up, that would have been radically different than Jude's. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, very different. Mine sounds a bit boring compared to Jude's, which is absolutely fascinating. I mean, I grew up in a middle-class area. My grandfather moved up from Tyrone and established a milk delivery business. My dad left school at 14, went to work as an assistant in a house furnishers, eventually had his own business selling furniture. My mother was a church organist. I did grow up in a family where, my parents didn't have enemies. They were who they were. They were the products of the sort of, hard-working Ulster Protestant ethos. My father was a very hard worker. My mother was, always there for us. We used to. The first holiday I remember was in Ballyvester. So we were probably only a stone's throw from where you were. But my father loved the south of Ireland, so we used to go for holidays to Kilkee and County Clare and to Greystones and to Donegal and to Killarney. They had honeymoon in Killarney. So my father loved the south, as we called it, and most of my childhood holidays were spent there. But he was just an ordinary. We were middle class because my father made a success of his business. Went to Grosvenor, which was known as a working class grammar school in those days. I had friends from Lord Street and from Trillick Street and from Euston Street, and I had friends from Hollywood and from the around the Stormont area. So I grew up. I think it's quite a sheltered background. When troubles kicked off in '69, my father was a bit pessimistic. He says this is not good. Don't like this. They want to drive us into the Republic. He would have been staunchly unionist in his politics, but he wasn't a particularly political animal. He didn't live and breathe it. He liked Brian Faulkner. He thought Faulkner was a decent and intelligent man. He wasn't at all keen on Ian Paisley. Didn't like what Ian Paisley was projecting or doing. So I suppose I'm pretty typical of, I think myself being typical of many Northern Irish people from a Protestant background who went through the state school system. Many of them, particularly many of my peers, moved away from Northern Ireland. I think the generation below me even more moved away, went to university in England or Scotland, didn't come back. So out of my class in Grosvenor, they end up in Scotland and Canada and places like that. Many of them England. I love this place. I love the country. I love the people. I then got involved in the Charismatic Renewal, Jude, which was in the 69, early 70s, late 70s, and it was a sort of neo-Pentecostal church experience that occurred both in the Catholic Church and in the Protestant churches. It occurred in the Friends Meeting Centre house in Dublin. There were meetings there that were very ecumenical. Here, it happened in the Catholic Church and in the Presbyterian Church. There were meetings in the assembly buildings, as were called in those days. I remember Father Neil Carlin speaking from the platform in the assembly buildings, making an evangelistic appeal to the people who were there. There were nuns and priests and young prods, and we were enthusiastic young evangelicals. And it was a very, very exciting time. And I think that was where I first encountered Catholics in any meaningful ways. I actually sat down, talked to them. They became friends, got to know them, tried to understand, their worldview, understand their understanding of faith, of God, of what it means to be a Christian. Became very good friends with a very fine man called Larry Kelly, who led the Lamb of God community and the Shalom on the Cliftonville Road. And I suppose so my worldview was broadened. My suddenly found Catholics who I said to my shame, I was surprised to find that they really loved God and passionately wanted to follow Him and serve Him, and I found that very, very appealing. So that was my introduction from growing up as a sort of East Belfast typical young prod, and then ending up discovering not just Ireland in the south, but discovering the sort of Catholic culture here in Belfast, and getting to know people like Des Dick and Larry Kelly and a whole number of folks who came to be very close friends.
Yeah. Well, I, like you, Jude, have many friends who are Catholics. I and the church parted way with the Incensum Benedictus Te.
Well, you're gonna burn in hell.
and I mean, you wouldn't be a man of strong religious convictions.
No, not strong by any means, but there is this residual
Cultural Catholic guilt.
and an insurance policy, I suppose, that in case there is. I mean, I do. I mean, I when it comes to, for example, we did a memorial for my mother there. If the priest wasn't there to bless the grave, it would not be complete in my view.
Yeah.
Now, I don't quite know why, and I do hope that one day, we're all going to meet again. It wouldn't be a strong religious, but it's definitely 60 years, certainly the first 20 years of socialisation and, going to, I mean, this is the bizarre thing about it. I actually do believe that, division is so ingrained in us that we just take it for granted that I went to a primary school 4 miles away because it was Catholic, St. Bernard's up there on the forest side. I then went to another Catholic school, the Christian Brothers. So by the time I got to 18, it was only because I was born in University Street that I'd ever met British people or Protestant people.
Yeah.
So by the time at 18, there was something there. I mean, there are many people I teach now who would say they have never ever, they don't have a meaningful relationship with anybody outside their own community. Of course, you know Catholics, of course, you know Protestants, or people who see themselves as British, and people see, but a meaning, and I don't have, at 64, 65 years of age, I have one meaningful relationship with one unionist. Yeah. And there's something a bit odd about that.
Yeah. Well, and you see, I think the problem is that that's not uncommon, that is the norm. Jude, I think for most of us, we tend to surround ourselves with people who are very like us, and we have those networks of friendship, and they end up being people like us. And yet they're probably, you and I are I mean, we know that we've got different childhoods, but there are many things that we have in common. And I think that we could very easily, if we invested in it, took the time, develop, you know, probably a very mutually rewarding friendship. But we do tend, I think, still to live as two communities, and I think that's a problem. Now, maybe it's less so in the under 40s, because you and I are sort of a similar generation. Maybe in the under 40s it's different. I just don't know the answer to that. I know that they're less tribal than we would be. You know, but then they didn't live through those 40 years, Jake, that you referred to. But I do think it's a challenge for us, you know, as a country. How I think that unionists, or folks from a unionist or Protestant background, do look. There's a certain amount of insecurity when we look at the South, and we feel that we're going to be pushed into a united Ireland. Whereas I think, if I be so bold as to say, I think within the nationalist population, children grow up and they're taught that the Brits are really bad. They caused all our problems. And I think that's translated now into Sinn Féin's sort of narrative that everything is blamed on the British government, especially those filthy Tories. They're to blame for all our problems. Well, I'm not sure that they are. I mean, I am not a lover of the Tories, or certainly of Boris Johnson's government, but I think we need to probably shoulder our own responsibility for the mess that we've made of this place, and recognise that we've all made mistakes, recognise that there are differences, but that those differences can be, as you said at the start, can enrich our lives and can make it a more interesting place. And I think that we do need to find a way to live together where we can get rid of this mindset of them and us.
Yep. Just to come back on something you raised, Jude, and also just to reflect on this. I mean, the blame game does nobody any good. We are where we are, and there are a number of incontrovertible facts. We're going to continue living where we live for the foreseeable future, regardless of what we call the place, regardless of how we view the place. And we can either make a good fist of it or a bad fist of it. But one of the big challenges that hasn't yet been grappled with in what is termed the peace process is dealing with that legacy, being honest about what brought us to 40 years of mutual slaughter, because we didn't all wake up one morning and decide that we wanted to kill each other. But I want to bring you back to the person that you mentioned in your last input, and that was your mother, and your mother's death. And that's something that brings us right into the heart of that argument about legacy. How do we deal with that? How do we move beyond that? So tell us about your mother. And
she was a wee woman that, I suppose, like many women of her time, she was the boss in the house. Her kids were better than any kids. We weren't allowed to play with the Roughnecks down at the bottom of the street because we owned our house. And Mummy and Daddy worked, and as for the Falls Road, you wouldn't be allowed near. I mean, looking back on it, this passage, she was a wee bit sort of a bit of a snobby type of wee woman, you know. But she was the boss. My dad had a bit of a problem with the booze, so she had to be the boss. But I mean, she was the least likely target you could ever imagine. I mean, my mum was in the Alliance Party. I mean, I can remember people like David Cook and Basil Glass and Oliver Napier being in our front room, you know, and everybody had to be nice and quiet and shush, and the best cups come out. And, you know, this was the only way, the only politic that could ever be, that even the SDLP for her would have been too radical. It was all about family allowance, you understand. You know what I mean? The more kids you have, the more money the Brits were giving you. And she died, I suppose, a Republican, because from 1972 until her death in 1984, she witnessed a complete transformation of this idyllic community she lived in University Street. This idyllic community, which was ravaged overwhelmingly by the UDR. And I mean, I say that after a lot of thought. The RUC did not impinge on our life anything the way, you know, people might expect. The change in that community came when the UDR were allowed to patrol it. A bit like asking Rangers supporters to go in with guns and patrol Celtic Park. It was a politically ridiculous decision, and looking back on it, it should never have happened. So, in many respects, she was politicised because she's seen her kids being stopped left, right and centre. She heard, in the evening, she was a taxi driver, she witnessed. You are what, in my view, you are what the society makes you. And I mean, I go back to the point that her, in the early 70s, couldn't believe how good a society it was she was living in. Sorry, up to the late 60s. And her attitude would have changed simply by looking at what was going on around you, often in complete disbelief. In complete disbelief. It's like having a relationship with somebody for the first 30 years. And I mean, you think of them every day and you're in love with them every moment of the day, and then find out they're not really the type, you know, the person that you feel they are. We are defined by the, you know, by the society we lived in. I mean, my late father, because he was called Isidore, that dreadful 5th of September, when a UDR man said to me he was going to murder your Fenian bee of a da, I mean, and I told that my dad me a slap around the head, as if like, are you serious, son? People have to try and understand that, you know, there were many Catholics, especially including my family. We were effectively unionists with a small U. Alliance was I can remember as a 15-year-old when the late Bob Cooper stood in West Belfast putting posters up in Turf Lodge, because I believed that quiche Lorraine and Voulafants and group hugs was the way out of this. My mother would have been a great supporter and a great participant in Coimísiúin, for example. You couldn't have said any sectarian word in our house. If you were watching the news, I can remember once I was imitating the accent of a British major, and my mother came over and scolded me and told me, that is totally out of order, you know what I mean? We must live together. And in some respects, your introduction to the question, I was listening to that in the 70s. We're going nowhere. You're going nowhere. So what are we going to do? I mean, are we going to live in perpetual disloyalty, perpetual tension, perpetual stress on two parallel lanes? Or is there anybody out there? Is there anybody out there can actually bring these lanes into one? And it will be dead interesting in a few weeks' time, your comments about people under 40. It's going to be very interesting because we are, I suppose, there is an expectation now that there's going to be, this could be a seismic election, and that this middle ground, whatever this middle ground is going to finally, you know, sort of step up. But if she were alive today and we had been living, say, where you were living, she would be in the Alliance Party. And that's the key thing. When I moved out of South Belfast, or when I lived in the market area, and when I moved over, some of the stories I hear from people, I understand their politics. I understand where they come from, because the society that you're in makes you. And I was very lucky when this conflict was on, I came from a family that in those days wasn't. I ran off to the University of Ulster and got myself a sociology degree, while many of my mates were lying in the cache on hunger strike. So, you know, in some respects, the hand that you're dealt makes the person that you are. And in her case, absolutely in her case, that night, that bomb was probably, for me, it was, my father could have died and she could have lived. The policeman at front who died could have lived. It was literally a moment of... but the following day, I can remember after her death, now what would she want me to do here? And she would have wanted me to do what I did, get into my car and go over to Braniel and put a mask card in to a policeman's house. And I can still remember that. Yeah. And she was right, I mean, she was at my right shoulder, because anything else, and this is the residual belief, you know, that there is a God and that there is an afterlife and somebody is looking at anything else, you would have been disappointed at.
Yes.
Yeah, but your mother and that young policeman died as a result of a second bomb at your home.
Yeah.
Some young lad from the village didn't just decide to blow up your mother and a young policeman because he didn't like the colour of your door. There was a huge...
the idea of somebody leaving, yes, I mean, the idea of somebody leaving today, you know, in early April 2022, and somebody leaving a house tonight and taking a bomb to a total stranger's house I mean, it's nearly unthinkable, to a total stranger's house. Yeah. So the first bomb was a young fella called David Maitland who blew himself up, and he's alive, ironically. He lived because of her. Because I was told, go out and put a pillow underneath that fella's, and you know, when I looked at this young fella, I could have killed him. I could have put the pillow on his head, and nobody would have known. But when he looked up and he says, Mister, don't kill me, something changed then in my head. Something changed when I seen that face and those eyes. And like yourself, I mean, a year or two later, when I met Irvine, and I'm on record as saying he's the greatest man I've ever met in my life. I'm on record as saying that. And the greatest man I didn't meet in my life is probably Bobby Sands. Yeah. And I totally remember the day that Irvine, you know, we started a bit of work in the Met, and to me that was the only way forward. Yeah. And you know, I mean, the context of violence, in my view, is just as important as the violence himself. Yeah. Why would my son from North Belfast go to your house tonight in East Belfast and plant a bomb there? It's unthinkable, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it shows you how when you light a fire, you can't control where it goes, and you can start off by provoking people to violence, but you've got no control over what then develops from it. And I think it makes the point that violence never produces good outcomes. You know, people use violence, and violence has been a part of this island, you know, for centuries. Political violence has been a part of this island for 150, 200 years. But political violence doesn't achieve good ends or good outcomes. There are always better ways to achieve your goal than to resort to political violence. And it brutalizes people. It was Tom Hartley said to me that violence always brutalizes, and it does brutalize people. Violence damages people, it damages relationships, it damages the next generation, and it's not a solution to anything. And even today, you know, people still talk about, if we're not careful, this will result in violence. Violence never properly solves problems. It may produce a short-term gain, but ultimately, in the longer term, it defeats both the people who use it and the recipients of it, the people who are the victims of it. So we do need to find a way. I mean, we can disagree intensely, and people can get very angry in terms of our disagreements. But to resort to violence, I think, is futile. But it is also very damaging to people, and that's why I think in our politics, one of the key concepts that we have to embrace is the concept of dignity. We have to treat people with dignity, treat them with respect. even if we disagree, even if we think that this person is a real thug, that this person is a bad person, still at the same time,
I'd like to
the line, you notice, I would point myself if I could, but for all of us, Jake, you know, we need to recognise we can't allow ourselves to treat people with contempt. Every person deserves to be treated with some measure of dignity and respect, and I think, you know, and that's what changes people. It's when they're treated with respect and with shown respect and treated with dignity, irrespective of what they've done. When that happens to them, that changes them. And when they're treated with kindness and with mercy, as you did to that chap, then that changes them as well. And those things, it may sound soft and wishy-washy, but those things are more powerful than the acts of violence. And what's more, they leave a far better legacy with people than the acts of violence do.
Just to focus in, I mean, because in reality, we've had 20 years of an absence of killing. We haven't had 20 years of peace. We've had 20 years of an absence of killing. And there are lots of David Maitlands out there now who have been fed a public diet of toxicity around their loss of culture, the fact that these people are coming to take away your birthright, that that Brexit and the protocol are dismantling everything you hold dear, and there's some quite inflammatory and toxic language being used on platforms around the place. And it reminds me, you know, as a child, I can remember the rallies in Ormeau Park when Bill Craig was thundering about something had to be done with these people, these upstarts, they have to be put back. And so I think that the party that you're in at the minute, the UUP, Doug Beattie took a stand for the leadership of that party when he said he wouldn't attend any more rallies which were having the effect of inflaming, and the response he got was to get his window put in his office. But the challenge, I think, for leaders, and that this is what differentiates people, we all just swim about our day to day, but people who accept public office accept the responsibility with that. And there is that, as you say, yes, you treat people with dignity, you treat people with respect, but there's that stretching yourself. How do we stretch ourselves that we start bringing those parallel lines a bit closer together? And that doesn't mean, how do you accommodate me? It means, how do I accommodate you? How do you see that challenge? How do you, in your daily politics and business, step up to that?
Gosh, that's a very good question. I think many of us, if not all of us, certainly most of us, have leadership responsibilities in some capacity. Now, it may be just leading your family, or it may be just leading a small team in work, but many of us have got leadership responsibilities. And how we exercise that leadership responsibility affects the culture, the ethos, you know, the relationships of that group of people that we lead, or that we have a leadership responsibility, or that we have a leadership role with. I think in politics, while we've had an absence of violence, we also have a huge deficit of respect, that people do not treat each other with respect. People treat each other as their enemies. They may not be fighting them, but certainly in their words and in their attitudes, they're treating them like enemies. And the interesting thing, if I could be so bold as to quote the Bible, Jesus did tell us to love our enemies, and there was no exclusion clause in that. And I think that's wisdom for us in Northern Ireland today. That we need to learn how to love our neighbour and how to love our enemy. And our neighbours are usually in Northern Ireland people of a similar religion, but even there, but less so. You know, places like Carryduff, Ballyhackamore, Finicky, more and more there are mixed communities. In East Belfast is much more mixed than people realise now. But we need to treat our neighbours with respect and with kindness. And as political leaders, we need to treat each other with respect. And I think Doug Beattie has tried to show respect to the people that he disagrees with. He hasn't bad-mouthed them, but he said, I'm not going to go there. I'm not prepared to do that. And it could be at a personal cost. But he said it's not right to do that, so I'm not going to do that because I don't believe it's the right thing to do. I admire that. I think that is leadership. And leadership involves risk. It involves doing things that may backfire on you. But if it's the right thing to do, a good leader will do it. So I'm just conscious that that the way that I treat people has implications. It's not just that I can sometimes get what I want if I bully somebody or if I demean them or if I criticize them, where I can get more more likes in my social media if I treat you as a scumbag. That is wrong, and I think that it's a challenge to do it because we do find ourselves in a situation that we find uncomfortable, that we find threatening, that we find undermining. We're in a situation where people treat us with contempt, with disrespect, but that's no excuse. I think for people who are in positions of public leadership, there is a responsibility upon them to set an example and to treat other people with more respect, even if they disagree, even if they find the person objectionable or obnoxious or a threat. You change the situation by treating people with respect and treating them with dignity, and that changes situations, and that changes it invariably in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean that Jude. I mean, love neighbours and all that. There is that whole Christian society that we live in. Mahatma Gandhi said he was drawn to Christianity until he seen how Christians treated each other, and that made him back off. But we're not good at how we treat each other, and very fundamental truths don't change. We can't change other people. You really only can change yourself. So what changes does Jude Whyte challenge himself to make to get to know more than one meaningful unionist friend?
Yes, indeed. I've been working with an organisation this last number of years called the Forgiveness Project. It's one of these sort of huggy-feely, London-based sort of quiche-eating, prawn-chewing organisations, but they're all basically very nice people, and they try to explore this concept. I believe we live in a society that is virtually beyond redemption. I mean, I cannot see in my lifetime, I'm 64, if I live to 84, I cannot see real and total integration of certainly working class communities. And it's interesting you said there about Carryduff and Ballyhackamore and Finnegan. I mean, because it's very hard. I mean, if somebody said to me, right, if you ask me anywhere in the north of Ireland or Northern Ireland, over 1,000 people, if I could tell you, and I didn't do a degree in it, I could tell you whether it's Broad or Fenian, whether it's British or Irish, whether it's them or us. I could tell you that. And the one thing I've often noticed, certainly when I was doing a bit of radio over here for the years, is Christians don't seem to be that good at Christianity. There's two rules: love God. Well, that's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. It's a concept. It's a matter nearly of private faith. Love your neighbour. Now, that is something that's very difficult.
It is. And
Christians don't seem to be
great
showing a lot of leadership when it comes to this. And then I've got to ask myself, do I hate Protestants? Do I hate them? And the answer is emphatically no. How can I hate people that I don't even know? I mean, you can hate this concept of, of the British. You can hate this concept of internment. You can hate this concept of, many politicians, what they espouse. But, I mean, that, if this is a Christian society and Christians could live by Christianity, I believe an awful lot of the troubles that we'll have here would disappear very, very quickly. But honestly, think about it for 1 second. Love your neighbour. It's dead on loving your neighbour where I live, because there's no Protestants near me. There's no Unionists near me, right? And it's probably dead on you know, in parts of East Belfast and parts of, as we look out this window, I could tell you nearly every street, Christians aren't good at Christianity. And probably Mahatma Gandhi was quite, was quite open and honest about that. I feel quite pessimistic, actually. And, these warm interactions that we're having now probably reflect us as people and our backgrounds and where we come from and what we do professionally. I mean, I feel very, very pessimistic about any real integration.
Well, that's interesting, because I'm sorry for interrupting you, Jude, but I am much more optimistic than that. I mean, I think that we have made enormous progress in the past 40 years. I think that we're obviously a more peaceful society, but there still are undercurrents and anxieties and anger and fear and lack of trust. I think that I think we are a more mixed society than we certainly used to be. You know, I mean, I do think the Woodstock Road in East Belfast is surprisingly mixed. So I'm more optimistic than that. But I think personal contact is the key to it. People are changed by people. And if we live segregated lives, then it reinforces our misperceptions of the other person. And that's why I think that in our schools, you have to find some way to get kids growing up together. The separation of the traditions is not good, and I know that the Catholic Church lays great store in creating a Catholic ethos in the schools, and that forms young people. But and I don't disagree with that. But we have to find some way for our young people to grow up not in a them and us frame of mind, and we need to be able to meet each other more. It's the human contact that begins to diffuse the misperceptions, the caricatures, the stereotypes, the false beliefs and myths that we have about the other. And it will always be the case that we'll need to create circumstances where people can meet, situations where people can sit down and chat. We need to facilitate that, and there's some aspects of modern life, like the 300 TV channels, social media, where you can sit at home and be in this virtual community, where you can buy your 6-pack and come home and sit down at home and just be on your own, but yet have all these screens that you can observe. That, in my mind, is not healthy. It's not good for people. It's not good for society. It's not good for individuals. It's not good for children. So personal contact, human interactions, face-to-face meetings, and that was one reason, Jake, why I came today, because I thought, I don't know Jake at all. I don't know what he's doing. I have these misgivings about the Irish language community and certainly about Sinn Féin and their political project. I need to see people more and meet them more, and we have to create a climate or culture or opportunities for people to meet and talk and listen and learn, and listening is a key to it all, I think.
We're going to have to draw it to a close. The time flies when you're
enjoying yourself, absolutely.
But I mean, it's Jude's pessimistic, but he's over 60.
Well over 60.
But he doesn't look it.
He's looking well. No, but I think that generation, I mean, under 40, they do have a different mindset than us. I mean, I'm an ex-IRA prisoner. I was in the H blocks all during the hunger strikes. I personally knew Bobby Sands. None of my children are radical Republicans. Mm-hmm. They're all university graduates. And the eldest son, when he decided to do youth work, and he came into his mother and he says, I've picked my placement. And Chrissy says, well, where are you going? He says, the Hammer and the Shankle. And Chrissy says, what are you going there for? Mm-hmm. And he says, Mummy, if those kids are left behind, they're going to be where my daddy and all was in the 60s. He says, so I'm going in there to just challenge myself. Yeah. Mummy says, but would you be safe? He says, of course I will. And she says, well, they know you're a Catholic. And he says, well, they call me Conor McShackis. They might be going on mastermind. He says, but I reckon they'll work that one out. Yeah. And it is that, it's personal decisions of saying, I'm going where I'm not comfortable.
Yes.
And pushing yourself to go where you haven't felt comfortable. But the most important thing, and I would come back to that, John, just by way of closing out your own contribution, treating people with dignity, treating people with respect, regardless of how you view them.
Yes.
Regardless of how you feel about what they are or what they've done. You know,
that's better expressed in the way that I expressed it, Jake. That I think you've captured that really well. That I was getting a bit tied up in what I was saying, but I think that summarises it very well.
Jude, give us an optimistic closure. Because I know you've got it in you.
Yeah, I know. I mean,
I've been in some wonderful places with you.
I know. I mean, I do feel our redemption will be this ability to forgive each other for what has happened. I mean, primarily, and that's a micro decision. After my mother was murdered, I was consumed with hatred. I was mentally ill, in my view, looking back on it. I couldn't function. I was a poor father, a poor husband, a poor lecturer. I was a wreck of a human being. And it was that, I suppose, road to Damascus moment, nearly. And Irvine was right in the middle of it. And I felt a far better person as a result of that. And I feel an awful lot better as a human being, better to my kids, better to my friends, better to my job. And to me, that is the only redemption that I can actually see. Alliance might get a few more votes, but people in this society are afraid of each other. Yeah. Why can't I go right now to the Shankill Road and go into the Rex bar and have a pint and feel comfortable? Why can't I do that? Yeah. I mean, it's ridiculous. I love drink, and I love working class communities. Yeah. Why are half the bars, half the social outlets in this society closed to me? Is it my imagination, or when I went in there with somebody Euphonian and hit me? Yeah. You know, those are the realities. These conversations are wonderful. The likelihood of you and I ever hitting each other was nil before we met, and it's now even minus nil. So, you know, the pessimism that I articulate, I suppose, is based on a realistic analysis. To me, the essence of any future here is the ability to forgive. And I'm not religious, and the Christians should really come up to the mark and start doing a wee bit more of that. And the central role, if I may just finish this, the central role in this, in my view, is victims. Victims need to come up to the mark. And I say that with all the grace that I can. You are probably the only constituency left that can lead this very damaged society out of this darkness, because you've got the moral authority. Okay, look, that was an extremely interesting exchange. I hope that both of you will continue challenging yourselves and each other. And it's that idea, Jude, and that's the real litmus test of this, that I want to live in a city where someone who is diametrically opposed to me can feel comfortable coming and sitting and having the coffee with me in the Falls, and where I can feel comfortable tagging along with him to the Rex bar because he owes me a pint. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Go near he live, and for this podcast, as we draw to a close, it's thanks very much, John Kyle, and best of luck in your coming election, and very good luck to Jude Whyte in whatever you end up doing. Whatever I end up doing. Thank you, Gurmy.